delighted to have this opportunity to, sorry, I'm just dismissing the message. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak. I also want to apologize that I'm speaking in English. I'm sorry, there it is. Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah, thank you once again for inviting me. So I want to talk a bit, and I guess, Stefan, you said you could maybe show my little PowerPoint. So I'll give you a minute to get that going. But while that's going, I wanted to say, let's see, what do I have to, hang on, I need to minimize my little screen now, hang on, there we are. Yeah, great. So you can see that. So there we are. So I want to talk about the potato as an emblem of modernity. That's what I want to focus on in this talk, because for some years, as Stefan has indicated, for some years, longer than I would care to remember, really, I worked on a global history of the potato and its importance in shaping the modern world. And maybe if we go to the next slide, you can see the if we can proceed to the next slide, then does that work? Let's see, on my screen, it's not moving forward, but maybe it's moving forward for you.
We are watching a map with some.
Oh no, so no, it should be the second slide after it's funny, the PowerPoint doesn't move forward for me. I can just see the first slide, but if you go to the second slide.
We are seeing the two books.
Yeah, perfect. There you are. Perfect. So I will.
The other persons are seeing this image?
No,
Stefan,
no. We're seeing the first slides.
Let me see. Now?
Yes, now I see the two glorious outcomes of this research. I don't know if anyone else can see them.
No.
If we go back, yeah, it's moving forward. So if you,
okay.
Yeah, brilliant. There you are. As I said, there you can see some of the outcomes of this project. And this entire project was viewed with what could best be described as bemusement by my friends and by members of my family, and for that matter, by many historians, because what is there to say, really, about potatoes? I mean, in particular, people asked me what possessed me to imagine that potatoes were in any way connected to the history of modernity. The forces that created the modern world, so capitalism or industrialization or colonialism, those are of obvious importance, as is the category of modernity itself. Those are important things. The potato, in contrast, is the antithesis of anything important. If potatoes symbolize anything, it's ordinariness. So what I'd like to do in this talk is to comment a bit about the ways in which the potato, I think, is part of the history of modernity. And so I want to start with a very brief review of how historians have typically discussed the potato. So I want to talk about three different ways in which historians have written about potatoes. And I want to start with the usual story of how the potato spread from the South American Andes, first to Europe and then to the rest of the world. So the standard story goes something like this. So so I'm reporting, right? This isn't my story. This is the standard story. It goes more or less like this, that although potatoes were a staple food for the millions of people who lived all along the Andes, from Chile through Peru and into Colombia, they were unknown to the rest of the world. Well, that's a part of that story I agree with. We could go to the next slide just to have a sort of visual image of this. And there we are. So there you can see in the map of South America, the approximate sites of domestication of potatoes. You can see a famous image from Felipe Guamampoma de Ayala showing a potato harvest. So this potatoes arrived in Europe as a result of the Spanish invasion of the Inca Empire in the 16th century. And here, this is how the sort of standard story goes. Once arriving in Europe, these staple foods of the Andes were viewed as an oddity, and scholars offered all sorts of different reasons for why Europeans, and particularly peasants in Europe, supposedly viewed the potato with suspicion and supposedly refused to eat them unless they were forced to do so by hunger and famine in the 18th century. But in the 18th century, so goes the story, hunger and famine combined with systematic encouragement by enlightened absolutists such as Frederick the Great. And here we can see another slide. And we can see, here's a 19th century image of Frederick the Great as a promoter of potatoes. The standard story goes that because of encouragement by people like the Prussian monarch Frederick the Great, potatoes moved from being a distrusted, odd food to being a cornerstone of the European diet. So that's a sort of standard story. And this is a story told particularly by food historians. So that's story one. So story two is another strand of this history of the potato. And this story has to do with the potato's spread around the rest of the world. So a number of scholars, actually starting from writers in the 1930s, a number of scholars examined the potato's penetration into ordinary diets outside of Europe. And these works show us, for example, we could go to the next slide, perfect, that potatoes reached China sometime in the 17th century, and that they were a common foodstuff in early 19th century India. Here you have a 19th century or early 20th century photograph of a potato market in Pune in India. And so scholars have shown that in India, for example, potatoes were being grown not just to feed the colonial British population, but as a staple food in Indian meals. Now, these scholars who work on the potato spread around the rest of the world have shown that unlike the stories about the potato's entry into Europe, the potato did not seem to be a particular problem to peasants in China or India, etc. The fact that the potato was novel and unfamiliar and grew from a tuber didn't seem to be an obstacle to its becoming a staple food. So this is quite a different sort of history from the standard history told about Europe, where peasants say, oh, we've never seen it before, we refuse to eat it. So that's story two. Finally, there's a third body of scholarship about the potato's global history. And these are works that are concerned with the growth of the population globally in the years after 1500. So a number of historians, and in fact economists, have argued that the steady growth in population in Europe and globally is due to a significant degree to better nutrition, because better nutrition increased life expectancy, it resulted in healthier children. And a number of scholars have singled out the potato as a particularly important source of superior nutrition. I think on the next slide, there's some examples of some of the scholarship focusing on the impact of the potato and other New World foods in world population group. And in fact, the economists Nathan Nunn and Nancy Keon attributed an astonishing 25% of world population growth since 1500 to the potato. I mean, an extraordinarily high figure. And in fact, these scholars who focus on the potato as a nutritional powerhouse are not wrong. The UN and many other international organizations concerned today with food security routinely detail the nutritional and agricultural merits of the potato, its high calorific yield, etc. But at the same time, I think you can see that there are clear inconsistencies between these three different potato histories. So first of all, if Europeans were refusing to eat potatoes until the late 18th century, when Frederick the Great encouraged them to do so, it's hard to see how potatoes can be the cause of population growth in Europe since 1500. I mean, that doesn't make sense. Likewise, if the potato did not become a common food in India until, let's say, the early 19th century, it can't be credited with global population growth in India or in China, for example. And it's also not clear why European peasants were so unwilling to eat unfamiliar foods, but Chinese peasants weren't. So, I mean, there's some inconsistencies. So we have a number of potato histories, all of which expand our knowledge of global foodways, but which are not completely consistent, nor, it turns out, entirely accurate. One of the things that I spent some energy researching was data on the potato spread in early modern Europe. And I satisfied myself, and I hope I satisfied some readers, that the protagonists of the potato spread around Europe were exactly those peasants who were supposedly refusing to eat potatoes because they were unfamiliar. So I spent some time trying to show that, and to show that actually peasant farmers are the agents of the potato spread. They're not an obstacle to it. But that's not the story I want to tell right now. The story I'd like to tell right now is to talk a little bit more about the potato's role in shaping the modern world. And I've touched on this a little bit already when I reviewed some of this scholarship about global population growth, because clearly global population growth and population growth in Europe is linked to industrialization, it's linked to overseas colonization. All of those are features of modernity. So we can start to see how the potato might be connected to some of the big world-shaping aspects of the modern society that we live in, if we can think the potato might be connected to industrialization, for example, or population growth. But what I want to stress here is a couple of other things. First of all, I think it's pretty clear that the potato's journey around the world, from the Andes to everywhere, was the result of colonialism and the slave trade and the early modern globalization of trade. Its movement to India was the result of Portuguese merchants trading between Europe and the Indian subcontinent, for example. Its spread around different parts of the Americas was the result of colonialism. Its spread into Africa was connected to the transatlantic slave trade. So its spread was absolutely connected to these forces of early modernity, colonialism, global trade, the transatlantic slave trade. But, and this is what I think makes the potato a really good emblem of modernity, despite the often violent and unequal forces that helped spread the potato around the world, in spite of the fact that its spread was connected to colonialism, often to violence, it actually became and has become strongly associated with national foodways all around the world. So if we think about the potato, we can go to the next slide, perhaps. And well, I forgot, we had some slides of population growth. Maybe go to the next one after that. There we are. I mean, in regions as diverse as Quebec and the Soviet Union or Russia, the potato is embedded in national foodways. So poutine, a classic of, a national food of French Canada, or salade olivier, a classic of Russian cuisine, are built out of the potato in ways that are are connected to national identity. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And perhaps at this moment, I should also stress that today the potato is cultivated in virtually every part of the world. And that in virtually every part of the world, the potato is seen as absolutely local. It's seen as a completely local foodstuff. They are the perfect immigrants. They have assimilated so successfully that in the centuries after their introduction into a particular region, people often forgot that there were not always already potatoes. So that, for example, when a French traveler visited Bogota in the 1820s, he noted that people in the market were selling what he considered exotic local vegetables, and he mentioned some of them. And he also said he was very surprised to see European vegetables, such as the potato, being sold in the market in Bogota. So potatoes, which, in fact, Europeans had first encountered not very far from Bogota in the 16th century, in the eyes of this 19th century French traveler, were European. Indeed, they were French as far as he was concerned. So we might consider potato as a symbol of the ceaseless movement and reformulation of identity that characterizes the modern world. Today, the potato is fully nationalized all around the world. The very names that we use to describe particular varieties of potato embed them right into the locale. So, for example, in India right now, there's a campaign underway to protect heritage varieties of potato, such as one that's called the Darjeeling red round potato. So you can see the names that potatoes have all around the world signify their localness to whether it's to Darjeeling or whether in Britain where I am, whether it's the island of Jersey, famous for its Jersey new potatoes. And many countries have national potato days that celebrate local varieties. In the United States, Idaho potatoes are protected under trademark legislation. And many countries use the machinery of international regulatory structures to nationalize potatoes by giving them this sort of formal status as part of the national patrimony. So Comber new potatoes in Northern Ireland, for example, have a protected international status, a bit like champagne. So what was once foreign now lies at the heart of national identity. And it's precisely this idea that animated a pair of German artists, maybe we can go to the next slide, to produce this poster as a way of commenting on the anti-immigration rhetoric that was circulating in Britain during the campaign for Brexit in 2016. So you can see this poster proclaiming potatoes are immigrants, in the context of a strong anti-immigrant backlash that was going on. So trying to remind Britons of how absolutely British potatoes have now become, whatever their origins. And meanwhile, in fact, in the Andes themselves, Chile and Peru are locked in a struggle over competing claims to where the potato was first domesticated. And therefore, who has the right to claim the potato as part of their national patrimony? So the potato's global journey is emblematic of modernity, both as a concrete process or a set of processes, colonialism, early modern globalization, trade, etc. Those concrete processes propelled the potato from the Andes to everywhere. But I think the potato is also emblematic of modernity because of the ways in which the consequences of these processes, the consequences of colonialism, global trade, etc., have been transformed into sources of national identity and pride. So if we want to think about food and national identity, it's not just sugar and a cup of tea in Britain, it's also a pile of takeaway chips or a plate of poutine or a bowl of salade olivier that can represent the fundamental role that migration plays in building national culture. So I think the potato is a good reminder of how migration and modernity and nationalism are fundamentally linked, also linked to everyday experience, something I'll maybe come back to. So that's one thing I want to say about how we can think about the potato as an emblem of modernity. But there are other ways we could do this too. And let me give you one more example. So here I want to talk about potatoes and capitalism. So I want to talk about the ways in which, over the 19th century, potatoes became entangled in arguments about the merits or defects of capitalism. So during the 19th century, as we all know, there were transformations in the nature of work, and that together with increasing industrialization generated fierce debates about social justice, about poverty, and about the role of the state. And at the center of these debates was the body of the worker, because the physical strength and resilience of the body of the worker was seen as fundamental to the success of national industry, the national economy, etc., during the 19th century. So I want to sketch out a little bit how potatoes and how the everyday eating practices of workers featured in debates about industrialization and economic change in the 19th century. I want to show how in 19th century Europe, talking about potatoes provided a way of talking about capitalism. So the first thing to say about that, if I want to try to explain this, is that from the late 18th century, European statesmen, political thinkers, etc., began to devote a completely new level of attention to the physical health of the working population. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but this was one of the new developments of the 19th century, that elites became interested in the diet of working people. And the robustness of working people was a topic of sustained debate across Europe, because it was widely agreed that the strength and the wealth of a state was directly connected to the energy and vitality of the working population. And this required a reliable supply of cheap and nourishing food. So as for example, we could go to the next slide, as the French government scientist Antoine-Augustin Parmentier put it, the type and choice of food greatly influences the population. So it is impossible to take too many precautions when ensuring that the people are well fed. And potatoes, as it happened, were increasingly identified as a particularly suitable source of food for working bodies. So this was a sort of late 18th century development. It also happened that the people who were most enthusiastic about potatoes in the late 18th century were generally people who embraced the free market as the best method for organizing economic affairs. Potatoes were celebrated by economic liberals, or we should say advocates of the free market, as a way of allowing individuals to improve their own health and well-being. So you should eat potatoes, it was argued, to improve your own health and the robustness of your own body. But at the same time, almost coincidentally, you would build a stronger economy and a more powerful state by helping to become a stronger worker yourself. So only by looking after your own self-interest, you would build a more powerful population and a more powerful state. It's not a coincidence that Adam Smith, we can go to the next slide, that Adam Smith was a super big fan of potatoes. That's not a coincidence. You know, it's connected to his vision of the potato. And so he argued that no food can afford a more decisive proof of its nourishing qualities or of its being particularly suitable to the health of the human constitution. So this was going on in the late 18th century, and this intense promotion of the potato during the 18th century gave it a powerful symbolic resonance, because it was insistently recommended to the working poor as a source of health and happiness and personal well-being in ways that made it closely associated with the move to the market economy and the dissolution of older models of social organization. Now, people who were opposed to those changes, people who were opposed to the rise of the free market and the celebration of an untrammeled market economy, people who opposed this were often explicit in seeing the potato as a component of that capitalist model. And nowhere is this association between potatoes and capitalism clearer than in the writings of William Cobbett. So we can go to the next slide, perhaps, to see a picture of William Cobbett. William Cobbett was a British political activist, a farmer, a journalist, an MP, in the first half of the 19th century in Britain. And he campaigned for parliamentary reform, for universal male suffrage, for higher wages for agricultural laborers, for lower taxes, and for decades insisted that the government must pay more attention to the needs of rural workers in England in particular. He was very concerned about the dismal situation of England's rural laborers. Real wages were falling, access to common land was being reduced, and the terms of agricultural employment were becoming more and more precarious. Cobbett was very critical of all of these developments and fundamentally critical of the rise of commercial agriculture, mechanization, and a focus on profit. So he was very opposed to this move towards a market economy in the countryside. He also, and not coincidentally, despised potatoes, which he associated completely with these unwelcome developments. In his view, potatoes were the cause of filth, misery, and slavery. And he held up the Irish potato-eating peasant as a terrifying vision of the future for British workers, because Cobbett argued that potatoes kept the Irish just about alive so they could be exploited by landowners. So he saw the potato as something that enabled the exploitation of rural workers by landowners who could pay them a pittance but in the knowledge that they would be able to feed themselves from their own potatoes. And Cobbett saw the enthusiasm for potatoes in England as part of a trick to try to drag down rural workers in England to the level of those in Ireland. You can go on to the next slide if that's okay. And we can see an example. He commented that these were efforts to bring the English laborers down to the state of the Irish, whose mode of living as to food is what one removed from that of the pig, and an ill-fed pig too. And he was absolutely certain, again, we can go on to the next slide perhaps, that the misery and degradation of the Irish were chiefly owing to the use of potatoes as the almost sole food. Cobbett was very unhappy that potatoes and tea had replaced what he saw as the much more healthy diet of beer and bacon and bread, which people used to eat, working people used to eat in England. And he was particularly critical at the claims about personal well-being that were made by advocates of the new liberal ideology. So liberalism was stressing that people should look after their own well-being, and that if they did that, that magically everyone's well-being would emerge triumphant. And so he was particularly critical of the claims that growing potatoes were a source of well-being and happiness to individual workers. He saw this as a trick on the part of landlords. And for example, during the debates in the 1830s in England about reducing the level of state support for the poor, he complained particularly about these claims that changing or reducing the amount of support for the poor would make people happier. Maybe there's another slide, but maybe I'll skip over that. And he argued that the real aim of these attempts were, perhaps we can skip over. Yeah, we can actually at the bottom of the, actually, sorry, go back. Sorry. At the bottom of this slide, you can see that Cobbett complained that all of these efforts to reduce the amount of government relief for the poor, etc., were an effort to try to get the working people in England to live off, as he put it, potatoes and seaweed. That was what he saw as the aim of all of these liberal reforms that were underway. So for Cobbett, the potato was an absolute enabler of capitalist exploitation, and it was a symbol of the dishonesty of advocates of the free market, and that they claimed it would make people happy, but actually it would make them miserable, poor, hungry, and even more oppressed than they had been. So this is a Cobbett view. So I hope you can see how this is connected, how he's connecting capitalism and the market economy to the potato in a very explicit way. So there's Cobbett. What did liberals, what did advocates of the free market have to say about the potato? Well, they saw the potato also as connected to the free market, but in a completely opposite way. They saw the potato as an obstacle to the free market. So I'll say a little bit about that. So advocates of liberal capitalism, I mean, what can we say about them? They looked forward to a bright future of rational economic practice and the sensible exchange of labor as one commodity, among others. And they objected to the potato because they saw it as allowing peasants to have too much autonomy from the market. So they objected to potatoes because it allowed people to escape the discipline of the market. And so for liberals, the potato symbolized exactly the sort of uneconomic behavior that they hoped to eradicate. So Cobbett and liberals disagreed profoundly about whether the potato enabled the spread of capitalism or whether it impeded the spread of capitalism. But they all agreed, all of them, that Ireland represented their own personal analysis. So we saw that Cobbett was citing Ireland as an example of where the potato was enabling the exploitation of workers by capitalist landlords. Liberals too saw Ireland as an illustration and as proof of their view that the potato was an impediment to capitalism. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. to make sense of that, we should step back for a minute and say that during the 18th century, in the previous century, Ireland was often applauded as a perfect example of why potatoes were great. So writers often said, look at the Irish peasants. They have 10 children. They just live off potatoes. It's wonderful. They can feed this huge, they're huge families just with potatoes. They grow the potatoes themselves. They don't have to worry about fluctuations in the market. And they're strong and healthy, and there are lots of them. And that makes Ireland strong. So it was a standard thing that people said in the 18th century. But by the early 19th century, the potato's ability to sustain large families independent of the market began to look a lot less attractive to liberal commentators. So as Britain's economy moved away from a fundamentally agrarian model towards a more industrial capitalist framework, this 18th century emphasis on building strong, self-sustaining, hearty populations was replaced with the view that wealth and power came from a smoothly functioning economic system, not just from a large population of diligent workers. The market economy was seen to demand not just healthy people, but a particular organization of society around specific forms of waged labor and specific relations between employers and the workforce, and the dominance of the market in setting prices and wages. And potatoes were increasingly seen as an impediment to all of those developments. And the autonomous potato-eating Irish peasant became, if we go to the next slide and skip, we'll go to that, then the next one after that. I think I'll skip that one. As the literary critic David Lloyd has put it, the potato began to be seen as a scandalous and destabilizing alternative to the economic and political forms that the reproduction of capital requires. And a beautiful illustration of this are the writings of Robert Malthus. So you would not be surprised to hear, I think, that Malthus was not enthusiastic about potatoes, because the potato was so much more productive than wheat. It enabled, as people in the 18th century noted, an unprecedented rate of population growth. But in the 18th century, this had been seen as splendid. That was a wonderful thing about potatoes. But to Malthus, this was a terrible disadvantage. So he saw the fact that the potato encouraged population growth as really dire. And he was convinced that Ireland was going to illustrate this. And so already in the early 19th century, he was predicting that the abundant supply of potatoes in Ireland was going to cause a catastrophe in the future. So he was predicting famine. He said that the potato will doubtless fail at some point, and the Irish population will outstrip the supply of food. And the outcome, he said, will be beyond all comparison terrible. And indeed, the truly terrible events of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s proved to Malthus's satisfaction that a situation which actually the British government had done much to cause. I mean, the famine in Ireland was significantly due to government policies of the British, but to Malthus's point of view, the famine in Ireland in the 1840s proved his point about food supply outstripping the population outstripping the food supply. So you can, again, start to see, I think, some connections between population growth and Malthus's ideas and the potato. And I want to say a little bit more about Malthus's views about the potato, because like Cobbett, in fact, Malthus associated the potato with poverty and degradation. And he argued that in Ireland, it was the potato as much as anything that helped keep the Irish in their impoverished and depressed state. He didn't see the cause of Ireland's poverty as being exploitation by landlords enabled by the potato. He saw it as backwardness and overpopulation enabled by the potato. And he argued that if the same practices were adopted in England, if people in England started having potato plots on a large scale and growing potatoes on a larger scale. What would happen then? He said, the rags and wretched cabins of Ireland will follow. So for him, an increase in potato consumption would be, perhaps we can go to the next slide. There we are. He said, if people in England started to eat more potatoes, this would be the most cruel and fatal blow to the happiness of the lower classes than they have ever received. So he saw the potato as something that would drag down the English workers. And he wrote a number of essays in which he took apart what he called the radical evil of the potato. And he linked their widespread consumption to the backward state of Irish laborers. So the cultivation of potatoes, as I was suggesting for Malthus, led to unsustainable population growth, but it did nothing, Malthus argued, to keep down the price of other commodities. And so it prevented rural workers from purchasing any of the other things that they needed to have a comfortable life. So Malthus argued that potatoes were bad for the Irish, and they set an ominous precedent for people in other parts of the world. Nothing possibly good could come from their consumption, according to Malthus. And Malthus and others of his ilk were explicit about the benefits that they thought would occur in Ireland as a result of the potato famine. The famine led to almost the complete destruction of Ireland's rural economy. And to people like Malthus, this offered a golden opportunity to reshape the Irish economy into a capitalist model. And so I want to give you a bit, I'll try to, before I move to a close pretty quickly, but writers commented that the result of the failure of this potato economy in Ireland was that rural workers in Ireland would have to become a rural proletariat. They would no longer be able to sustain themselves with potatoes. They would have to work for wages as a rural proletariat. They would stop eating potatoes, it was hoped. They would start eating wheat, which they would buy out of their wages. And all of this was described as being something that would lead to a tremendous improvement in Irish agriculture overall. So the famine was described as a golden opportunity, a glorious opportunity by liberal writers, because it would drag the rural Irish proletariat, or the rural Irish population, into the rural proletariat and force them to become wage laborers. And they would stop living off a subsistence agricultural system, and they would become part of the capitalist world. So this was seen as a vast improvement in what was happening in Ireland. So the potato had represented the failure of the Irish to enter the modern world, and its eradication would symbolize the entry of Ireland into the modern capitalist world. So these same views about the terrible effects of the potato on Ireland were expressed with equal clarity by another economist, the Scottish economist, John Ramsay MacCulloch, who was a disciple of David Ricardo. And in his own analysis of Ireland, he argued that the tiny plots of land onto which Irish laborers were squeezed had the effect of stifling any spirit of industry. It stifled any desire for self-improvement, and that Irish peasants lacked contact with the stimulating forces of the outside world. And so they sank. Maybe there's a slide, maybe if we go to the next slide, we can see, I think I have maybe MacCulloch and the one after that, perhaps. There we are. They argued that the result of the old potato economy was that Irish laborers sank into a state of apathy and sluggish and stupid indifference. They cannot act collectively, and therefore must submit themselves with less resistance to the yoke of the oppressor, in MacCulloch's view. So the autonomy of the potato was no autonomy at all in the view of these liberal capitalist economists. Well, writing in London in the early 1850s, capitalism's greatest theorist, Karl Marx, drew on precisely these notions when he described the politically inert French peasantry as potatoes in a sack. Perfect. In his 18th Brumaire, he argued that the French nation consisted of little more than a disparate mass of disconnected peasants, much the same way that a collection of potatoes constituted a sack of potatoes. neither the French peasants all added together nor a bunch of potatoes in a sack amounted to anything more. There was no collective identity. A bag of potatoes doesn't have a collective identity. It's just a bag of potatoes. So just like McCulloch had argued that the isolation created by the Irish potato system meant that peasants cannot act collectively and must submit to the yoke of the oppressor, Marx argued that peasants, as he put it, cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. So I hope you can see how this famous quote from Marx and his use of the potato as a symbol is actually drawing on a widespread discourse about the connections between potatoes and peasants and capitalism. So it's little wonder that Marx selected the potato as a way of describing this isolation from the modern world that he was condemning, in this case, in the example of France. So I want to conclude. I want to try to pull this all together into some kind of conclusion. So what have I been trying to say? That over the course of the 19th century, potatoes came to represent essential features of the new economic structures that were reshaping Europe. Marx hardly needed to travel to London to absorb this image of the potato as an emblem of isolation from modern capitalism. This, in many parts of Europe, the potato had by mid-century come to epitomize a stagnant world lacking sociability, lacking consumer desires, and characterized by the persistence of pre-capitalist forms of production. That was what the potato came to represent in many parts of Europe by the second half of the 19th century. So we can go to one more, nearly the last slide. So this was beautifully summed up, I think, by a French writer in the 1870s who said, what progress can one expect from a people who are content to eat potatoes? That was, those people who eat potatoes are fundamentally isolated, as I said, from sociability, from consumer desires, and from the modern world. So what I've tried to suggest is that thinking about potatoes can help us think about how the everyday eating habits of ordinary people became embedded in some of the most fundamental debates about the nature of economic and political life in the 19th century in Europe. And I think those debates about the nature of economic and political life lie at the heart of modernity itself. I think these debates about capitalism are at the heart of modernity. So I think maybe the ordinary potato isn't such a bad emblem of modernity. I've tried to suggest that its global presence is a function of some of the most important forces shaping the modern world, such as colonialism or increasing globalization. I've tried to suggest that the nationalization of the potato as a heritage food in many different parts of the world illustrates the powerful ability of nationalism to transform everyday life into political culture. And I've also tried to suggest that potatoes offered 19th century Europeans a way of, crystallizing the enormous economic changes that were being wrought by modernity into a single, concise, pithy emblem of capitalism itself. The fact that it was an everyday foodstuff that was so successful in crystallizing these debates about capitalism, the fact that some ordinary thing like a potato could become such a powerful symbol of these debates about modernity, maybe that shouldn't actually surprise us very much, because I think perhaps the most fundamental feature of modernity is the way that it inscribes itself into and onto our bodies, linking us in chains of consumption to people and to things all over the world. Thank you very much.
Great, Rebecca, thank you very much. Entonces, vamos a empezar con un ciclo de preguntas. Propongo que hagamos lo siguiente, hacer 3, 4 preguntas para que Rebeca las responda y después hacemos una nueva ronda, ¿les parece? Bueno, perfecto. Entonces, no sé, ¿alguien tiene preguntas? Veo que Sean tiene la mano levantada, había alguna otra mano, pero ya no. Bueno, si quieres, Sean, adelante, por favor.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll do this in English. Rebecca, no, thanks very much for the talk. I feel privileged to have the opportunity to listen to such a wonderful story in such a small group, like a little private session. No, I thought the story was fantastic. I have, that's like one big question, but I'm going to sort of wind my way to it. A few years ago, I lived in Germany, and one of the surprising things that I found there was that everything you can buy in the supermarket comes in little sacks. So you can buy 1 pound of lentils, a pound of rice, maybe a kilo, but everything's very small, except huge bags of potatoes. That was the only thing you could buy in large quantities. And so, I mean, it shows, I mean, when you look at per capita consumption patterns, I mean, they eat lots of potatoes in Germany and Central Europe, so it's maybe not so surprising, right? But one of the things that I've never been able to explain, and a number of years ago, I was teaching a class in the history of food, and I would compare let's say like the travel or the diffusion of the potato and corn across Europe from the early colonial period. And the story that you tell of the potato is totally a fascinating story. And I mean, what was surprising to me, I mean, my level of knowledge of it is superficial, but how much is connected to all these discourses of the rise of capitalism. I think that's totally fantastic. But there's a curious thing is that you see a similar pattern in terms of the, let's say, like the growth of corn consumption. So, corn consumption in the Mediterranean areas. And for much of the same reasons, the peasantry lost access to much of its land, it's cheaper food. And so it's the lowest common denominator to feed peasants. But one of the interesting things that happens is that when cheap grain or wheat comes in from the United States or Canada or Southern Europe at the end of the 19th century, corn consumption in Italy drops off. And so when you think about what Italian dishes have corn, besides polenta, I mean, it's really hard to think of very many dishes. Whereas in Germany, or in Central Europe and around Northern Europe, like the potato, even though it was viewed so negatively, becomes part of the national cuisine. So you have all these different kinds of dishes that come up in terms of the things that are made with potatoes becomes, in a sense, adopted by the middle and upper classes. The question is like, why do you think a food that was viewed so badly became so adopted in one place, whereas like the other food didn't? That would be my question.
Yeah, so that covers a lot. That's a very good question. So I think that there are several components to answering that question. One is that the potato was despised by political commentators in the 19th century in the way that I was describing. So people who were either opposed to the persistence of peasant agriculture were opposed to potatoes, as I was describing. And there's lots of scientific debate in Germany, for example, about why potatoes are an inferior food compared to bread, and they produce a sluggishness and an apathy in the body of people who eat them, and that they make you more prone to tuberculosis. I mean, there was a whole medical debate in the 19th century about potatoes. And I was also suggesting that people who were opposed to the move towards capitalism were critical of potatoes. But at the same time that this political debate was going on, in which the potato became a symbol, the potato had become absolutely widespread in European diets in many parts of Europe. So there's a sort of disconnect. I mean, the reason the potato was such a good symbol in some ways was because it was so universally present in many parts of Europe by the early 19th century. And so I don't think the potato was despised at all by peasants in the early modern period. I think that story is wrong. I think the story that potatoes were something that was introduced top down by the elites does a terrible injustice to peasant farmers, who are actually the people who localized this food stuff. So I don't think we need to explain how something that was once rejected, became so widely eaten, because I would suggest it wasn't really rejected. It was embraced pretty quickly. So then the question is why? Why more so than maize, for example? So that, I think, we have to become a little bit materialist, and we have to think that, maybe the potato isn't just a cultural construct or an emblem of something. It actually is a material object that has certain horticultural qualities. And the potato is incredibly adaptable as a foodstuff. And I think that partly explains its success. So it grows, for example, on all kinds of different terrains. It's as people in the Andes knew millennia ago, it grows very successfully on steep slopes which can't be plowed or anything like that. So all around the world, the potato has often first been embraced by people living on marginal land that isn't suitable for raising grain, for example. And it's also highly productive, highly calorific. It uses very little water per hectare, per calorie compared to most other foodstuffs. There are all sorts of advantages to the potato, which is actually a big improvement on wheat or rye in terms of productivity. Even maize doesn't have that. And I think maize is less versatile in terms of the climates in which it can grow. So I think we have to pay a little attention to the material qualities of the foodstuff. That said, and I'll shut up after this, that said, in the areas where maize has become really widely cultivated, it has become highly nationalized. So you mentioned its role in polenta in the region around Venice. So, for example, what is it called? The Liga del Norte, this sort of right-wing anti-immigrant group in northern Italy, was protesting some years ago against the influx of North Africans into the region around Venice. There were posters that people marched with that said, basically, more polenta, less couscous. So polenta then became a symbol of national Venetian identity. So, where that food has been eaten, it becomes well embedded. It's been strongly nationalized. So we can see that process happening with maize as well. But anyway, I've gone. I hope that addresses a little bit that question.
Yo creo que voy a meter la cuchara quizás para la segunda mitad del siglo XIX también. Lo que preguntaba Sean puede tener que ver con la relación entre maíz y pelagra, que fue una enfermedad muy grave en países como el sur de Italia, en España, que quizás también jugaron un papel ahí, a diferencia de la papa, ¿no? De nuevo, no solo en la parte simbólica, representacional, sino que efectivamente había una conexión entre una enfermedad que estaba causando estragos grandes en estas regiones y el maíz, ¿no?
Yeah, I think that is also, certainly that's true. And it's also a good reminder that we should not think about these global food journeys as simply a foodstuff traveling around the world. We also need to think about the agricultural and the culinary technologies that supported it. So the culinary technologies such as nixtamalization in Mesoamerica was central to making maize a suitable foodstuff for building the huge population that inhabited Mesoamerica before 1492. So we should remember that foods they don't eat themselves. You need to prepare them. And with the loss of that technology came exactly these deficiency diseases such as pellagra. So I think it's also a useful reminder to us as historians to pay attention to what happens in the kitchen.
¿Tienes una pregunta hacia adelante?
Hey, my name is Nicolas Carcao. I'm here in the auditorium. Thanks for the lecture. I want to ask you about the capitalization process of potatoes, because there is so many ways to turn just a commodity, thinking of a bunch of goods or random stuff, into a capitalist commodity. And I want to ask you if you see some difference between the capitalization of the potatoes and the meat market on the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, related to all this economical and political discussion, but also on to the debate in between the protein category versus the vitamin category and the calorie category, because all those elements conform different kind of perspectives about which one of the nutrients is the best for some need. In this case, for building a certain kind of a specific population to work on the capitalism and capitalist and industrial ways. So do you see any kind of difference in between this process between potatoes, carbohydrates, and meat and protein?
Yeah, I think that's a really important set of connections. So when Sean was, in response to what Sean was saying, I think I was saying that there's a lot of nutritional writing about the potato in the second half of the 19th century, which is generally very critical of the potato. And it's absolutely connected. It's seen as an alternative to an appropriately protein-rich diet. So the language of protein is really important to discussing the potato's supposed inadequacy in the late 19th century. And so there's a lot of writing that tries to calibrate the, what an optimal diet for a worker should contain, should be a lot of protein. And the potato was seen as having useless carbohydrates. It was seen as being worse than bread. So bread wasn't always so great, but the potato was even worse. And it wasn't really until the invention or the discovery of vitamins in the first decades of the 20th century that the potato started to be seen by nutritionists as having anything useful to contribute whatsoever to diet. But from the early 20th century, then, as nutritional science started to become more interested in vitamins and not just protein and fat, the potato's reputation as a healthful food began to increase. And so by the outbreak of the First World War, the potato had sort of been restored to its status as a nutritional powerhouse. And all of the countries involved in the First World War encouraged increased potato consumption and set up government departments devoted to promoting potatoes, etc., because they were seen as healthful and nutritious and filling. But meat was absolutely the foodstuff that was the focus of ideal attention during this period. And what's sort of interesting is that all through the 19th century, when the potato was often being, as I was suggested, being used as an emblem of capitalism by anti-capitalist protesters, even then, the people who complained about potatoes were also happy to eat potatoes. So, I mean, William Cobbett, for example, who I was discussing, right? At one point, he went so far as to say that any servant, any employee of his who came onto his own property bringing potatoes would be fired on the spot. If he saw workers who were, bringing potatoes to eat, they would lose their job unless the potato was to be used to stuff goose. So if you were going to use the potato to make a stuffing to put inside a goose, that was fine, right? So it was no objection to the potato. It was an objection to the potato as the basis of your diet, if that makes sense, right? So there were lots of these people like William Cobbett who were protesting about potatoes. In the 1830s in Britain, there were huge, basically anti-capitalist riots in the countryside against the mechanization of labor. And very often the potato was a symbol of what people were protesting against. So they would carry banners that said things like, "We will not live upon potatoes." But the people carrying the banners were very happy to eat potatoes. They just didn't want to be eating only potatoes, right? So the argument was always about whether eating a potato-based diet was bad for you, or whether you should be having a diet that had lots of meat and you had some potatoes that you had with your meat. So you have to sort of see, not just look at individual ingredients, but also look at the plates, the diets that were being recommended and debated. So I hope that answers a little bit this question.
Thank you very much.
Sí, adelante Agustín. Sí. Soy Agustín Edo Galán, estoy aquí en el Instituto de Historia de la Ciencia, también en Barcelona. Gracias por la presentación. Yo tenía una primera pregunta, que es una curiosidad. Este éxito tan extraordinario en la aclimatación de las patatas en cualquier lugar del mundo, cualquier contexto, a cualquier hábitat, ¿sabemos históricamente cómo se produce? ¿Es una especie de habilidad de los propios campesinos? ¿Intervienen naturalistas, expertos de alguna manera, agrónomos? Depende de la época. ¿Sabemos con un poco más de detalle cómo se produjeron estos procesos de aclimatación? Muy exitosa por otra parte, ¿no? Pero al mismo tiempo esto era un gran reto con todas las plantas exóticas que llegaban a Europa, etcétera, los jardines botánicos. Es un gran tema este, ¿no? Esta es una primera curiosidad, ¿no? Y la segunda, el tema de modernity, que creo que es muy importante, ¿no? Muy interesante en relación a potato. Mi pregunta sería, tal como has presentado la utilización, la apropiación de las patatas para la construcción de estos discursos de modernidad, los ejemplos que has presentado no son demasiado eurocéntricos, ingleses, franceses, europeos, occidentales. Es decir, en estas nuevas tendencias historiográficas de modernities en plural, ¿no sería más compleja esta cuestión? Lo planteo así como un tema más general, digamos.
Yes, well, I absolutely agree. So I was giving you a very Eurocentric presentation, so I absolutely agree about that. And I guess that was partly because I wanted to talk about these. I wanted to find something that I thought seemed unquestionably connected to modernity. And I thought you will all accept that debates about capitalism are part of modernity. And those debates you can see particularly sharply for example, in Western Europe and in Britain during that period. So I thought, okay, I'll give this example. But I completely agree that I think we have to tell much more local examples and that connect with the idea of, I guess I'm sort of agnostic about whether I feel modernity is a single phenomenon or whether there are multiple modernities. I certainly think it's a global process, and that it's not a process that radiates outward from Europe. I think that's, I think we can probably all agree with that from the start, right? I don't think I need to spend any time arguing for that. But whether they're different modernities or whether they're all the same modernity, as I said, I'm not sure that I have a dog in that fight, as they say. But certainly we can tell other examples about the potato's connections to modernity outside of Europe. So a really good example is India. So potatoes arrived in India through first trade with Europe and then through European colonization. So as I said, it was first Portuguese traders, I think, who brought potatoes to the Indian subcontinent. And then it was British colonization and imperialism that really embedded the potato as an agricultural crop in many ways, because the British wanted to eat it. And the British saw the potato as one of their gifts to India. So pro-imperial rhetoric from the British in the 19th century, in the 18th century too, talked about the way in which British imperialism had supposedly improved the food supply of people in India by bringing better foods and better agricultural techniques. We know that the story was the exact opposite. We know that the British were responsible for horrendous famines from the 18th century onward. But leave that aside, the British colonial rhetoric was embracing the potato as a symbol of European progress in India. So the Andean potato became, in colonial India, a sign of European superiority. Okay, so that was that. So what did Indian nationalists do with the potato? So interestingly, by the late 19th century in India, as the nationalist movement was developing, they too were making use of global nutritional science in their own analysis of imperialism and in the way in which they approached fighting against imperialism. And there was a whole movement from late 19th century India encouraging Indians to adopt a kind of body culture that would allow them to build up their strength so that they would become physically more powerful, that would enable them better to resist imperialism. I mean, the most famous example of this is Gandhi, in fact, by the early 20th century, when Gandhi had a brief period where he believed he had to become a meat eater in order to be strong enough to lead, to become an important player in the nationalist movement. And he briefly tried this and then gave up on it. But he was one of a number of people who argued that embracing elements of the Western diet would be important to making the British defeatable. And the potato also featured as part of this improved dietary that was being recommended as a nationalist tool. So the very potato that the British were saying, oh, this is yet another gift that we, the British, have given you, the Indians, for Indian nationalists was becoming a weapon that could be turned against the British in order to facilitate the anti-imperial fight. So we can see that the potato's role, let's say, in anti-imperialism in India has a very specific and distinct local story that we could tell. So there are various ways that we can, that's one example, but I completely agree with you that we need to look more globally to understand the potato's connections to modernity and its diverse features. And, don't give me an opportunity or don't invite me to do that more, or I'll keep talking, but I think there's lots to be said. In terms of habitat, yes, I think peasants deserve the credit for this in early modern Europe. I think it was peasants who worked out how to adapt the potato to the different climatic conditions of different parts of Europe. And we don't know this because we have good scientific studies. We know this simply because we have accounts from members of the elite saying, oh yeah, they're growing in peasant fields, in peasant gardens all over this part of Germany. Oh yeah, we see them in northern Italy growing in farmers' gardens. So they must have figured out how to do that. So there's, the evidence shows that the first people who were growing them as a foodstuff were peasants. So they had evidently figured out how to do this. And we should remember that peasant farmers are used to adapting foodstuffs. This is what people who study peasant farmers today find, that they're constantly experimenting. They're empirical in their approach, and they engage in all sorts of trials. They exchange seeds with their neighbors. They try things out. They see if they work. They move plants around to different soils. So there's lots of evidence to show that peasant farmers today are experimentalists. I think there's no reason to imagine that that was not the case some hundreds of years ago. By the 19th century, of course, you start getting agronomy as a science that's being developed at universities. And by the early 20th century, a number of universities have potato breeding programs, and the rise of potato breeding as a science is absolutely responsible for the creation of many of the what one scholar called the scientific potato, which is grown in many parts of the world, including on peasant plots. So if you look at peasant plots in the Andes, they might have a combination of local varieties and scientifically bred varieties that will be grown for different purposes. So they're different protagonists at different stages in the history and in different parts of the market. So of course, the agronomic programs are associated with commercially successful varieties, and the local land races are often grown for either local consumption or for individual consumption. So potatoes serve different functions for, and different potatoes are grown for different purposes. Sorry, that was another very long answer.
Okay, thank you very much. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, si no hay, yo quisiera hacer un comentario, Rebeca, que retomar algo que dijiste hace un rato, y es cuando yo hice mi tesis doctoral en historia de la ciencia, estaba un poco, ¿no?, tomando fuerza lo que podríamos llamar de material turn, ¿no?, el giro material de historia de la ciencia. Y aunque a mí me interesaba, etcétera, viéndolo en retrospectiva, ¿no?, sentía que mi tesis doctoral, que es sobre la termodinámica, pues terminó siendo muy discursiva, ¿no?, muy prestando atención como más sobre todo a los discursos, ¿no?, a lo dicho. Y quizás cuando empecé a entrar en la historia de la alimentación fue cuando realmente, ¿cómo decirlo?, capté o pude realmente profundizar en esta idea de lo material, ¿no? Y cada vez me he alejado o he tratado de articular la historia de lo que dicen los médicos, los políticos, yo qué sé, los científicos en general, con la historia material de los alimentos, ¿no? Creo que en este seminario lo hemos discutido varias veces. Algunas leímos este libro de Atkins sobre la leche, donde él llamaba la atención sobre cómo la historia de la alimentación se le había olvidado casi siempre analizar en profundidad la misma materialidad de los alimentos, ¿no? Y tú mencionabas algo al respecto sobre la papa, es decir, no es solo lo que decimos y las capas de significado que van adquiriendo un alimento discursivamente, simbólicamente, representacionalmente, sino también la misma materialidad, su capacidad de adaptación, esto cómo ocurre, ¿no? Si quieres, aprovechando que este es el año de Latour, ¿no?, que decía, hay una frase de Latour que me gusta mucho, que era: la historia de la tecnología es la historia a secas extendida a las cosas. Y creo que la historia de la alimentación debería prestarle mucha más atención a la misma materialidad. Ya podemos entrar en discusiones más abstractas, si los alimentos tienen agencia en sí mismo o no, ¿no? Las cosas tienen agencia o no. Pero sí creo que es muy interesante ver esa materialidad. Con José estuvimos, y otros colegas estuvimos, por ejemplo, haciendo un dossier sobre la leche recientemente, y también nos llama, no, a mí me llama mucho la atención las múltiples vidas que tiene la leche, ¿no? Y creo que tu experiencia, tu larga experiencia con las papas, me gustaría saber un poco esa sensibilidad que has ido adquiriendo y metodológicamente cómo la has tratado de resolver a la hora de tratar de prestarle atención, darle, si quieres llamarlo agencia histórica, o simplemente mayor importancia a la misma materialidad de los alimentos. No sé si pudieras discutir algo al respecto.
Yeah, so do I want to adopt a Latourian approach to be protagonizing the agency of the potato? I think it would be possible to do. That wasn't so much the approach that I was taking. What I have a great PhD student, a Colombian student, who's working on the trade between Colombia and Britain in orchids in the 19th century. And he's very interested in a sort of critical plant studies approach, where he's thinking about the agency of the orchids. Sorry, I've just dropped my slipper. That's why I'm bending over. The agency of orchids in this trade. So it's something I think about quite regularly when I talk to my student. He's called Camilo Uribe. But it's not really so much what the approach that I think I've taken here. What I'm interested in, particularly in as concerns the materiality of the potato, is the following question. I'm interested in what is the historical utility of attempting to recreate historic recipes in particular. So I'm really interested in the debate about reenactment of recipes, because on the one hand, there's so much evidence that the plants themselves have changed so much. the more that we know about the connections between, you know, soil and the fungal components of soil and the way in which that affects the flavor and the of foodstuffs and the nutritional content of foodstuffs. I mean, all of this science that's coming out now encourages us to question whether a potato that I eat, even if it's the same variety as a potato that existed 200 years ago, is it really the same thing? You know, to what extent is a particular type of potato constant across history? You know, I'm quite interested in that. So if we want to take the materiality seriously, we have to ask that sort of question. But at the same time, it also seems to me it would be daft to suggest that recreating a historical recipe tells you nothing. I mean, to say that if you try to cook a recipe and you learn nothing from that experience, that would seem to me a peculiar position for historians to take. So I think we learn something about the materiality of the world of the past when we try to engage with its material practices, right? That engaging with the material practices of people in the past helps us understand materiality. But it's a difficult thing to do because the materials that we're working with may be very different. So I guess that's, to me, one of the questions about materiality I'm interested in. I don't know if that's something that the rest of the seminar has an opinion about, or whether there are people here who either are interested in recreating or, you know, historical experiments or recipes, or whether that's something you discussed. I'd be really interested in hearing about that.
No sé, ¿alguien tiene algo? ¿Se le ocurre algo al respecto? Sí, Sean?
No, I have no idea. I've never even thought about the idea of, I mean, I've thought about the idea of cooking historical recipes, but not thinking so seriously about the historical recipes themselves. I think it's an interesting idea. I wonder, though, really what changes more, the actual food product or our own sensibilities, our own sense of taste, that might be so radically different, so used to a whole bunch of other flavors that even if the product was the same, we wouldn't taste it in the same way. But here you enter like this philosophical, where I don't know, like where you stand, like how you do research on that, on those lines. Yeah, well, here, I mean, yeah, I'll leave it there. I have another question, but it's very different.
May I add something? Yes, no, just I think in history of science there is a very interesting debate to what extent is useful to reconstruct experiments from the past. And I think that the community is quite split between two positions. Yeah, some people really enthusiastic, trying to build up, I don't know, the Coulomb electrostatic balance in the 18th century and doing again the experiment today. This is something that Norton Wise and other people did many years ago. And others that are very reluctant. Yeah, that means it's just impossible to use the same materials that existed in the 18th century. That means it's no worth doing that. But others maybe in between would say, well, let's do that as a sort of heuristic epistemological experience which might inspire our own research. Yeah? And I think this might be also extrapolated to cooking recipes or even craftsman recipes in dyeing or in metallurgy and other fields, also linked with the old alchemical tradition of working with metals. There is a lot of tacit knowledge there. For example, historians of alchemy have been also working, Newman and other historians of alchemy have been trying to really reconstruct some of the alchemical experiments with present day materials, which is a bit odd at the same time. But for them, I think it was Lawrence Princip, I think he argued that this was a way to strengthen their epistemological approach to the alchemical culture. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting debate methodologically in historical research, at least in our field nowadays.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I agree. My question is very much connected to this question of what historians of science are doing, exactly as you were saying. I think I agree with what you said.
Thank you. Sí, yo quizás pensando en este artículo que escribí una vez sobre la chicha, ¿no? Esta bebida fermentada de maíz, cuyas narrativas históricas y antropológicas son muy discursivas, en el sentido de que la chicha encarna no el capitalismo, sino la tradición, lo indígena, lo local, y un poco la sensibilidad material de la chicha me hizo preguntarme, bueno, pero ¿cómo se preparaba la chicha? ¿Siempre ha sido la misma chicha? ¿Sí? Quizás debía haberla también preparado, pero bueno, nunca lo hice. Pero si busqué como indicios históricos de cómo se producía la chicha en el siglo XIX, y es una chicha del intercambio colombino, porque la chicha que se tomaba en Colombia tenía caña de azúcar, ¿no? Entonces ya no es solo de maíz, y además se producía industrialmente, ¿no? En Bogotá se producían, no sé, 80 millones de litros de chicha al año, 7 fábricas de chicha había en Bogotá en 1930. Entonces, sí que por lo menos esa sensibilidad a lo material, y yo estoy de acuerdo, sí, a veces a mí también lo veo más como una herramienta heurística, ¿no? Esta posición laturiana de la agencia de las cosas, pero sí una sensibilidad a preguntarse por eso, cómo se produce, dónde, y no quedarse simplemente en digamos, en cómo las mismas narrativas históricas y antropológicas terminan asignándole unos significados particulares a ciertos alimentos, ¿no? Y creo que eso ayuda también a profundizar más, usando, digamos, este concepto de Apadurai, la vida social de las cosas, ¿no? Quizás.
Yeah, I think so. And I think in terms of Sean's point about whether we can taste the same things as people in the past, I heard, so Jeffrey Pilcher, the food historian, commented in a talk that I heard him give a couple of years ago. He said, very matter-of-factly, as if this were obvious, I thought it was very profound, but he said, well, taste is a function of memory, and therefore nobody tastes the same thing as anyone else. He said it was as simple as that, you know. And I thought, okay, very interesting idea.
Bueno, chicos, creo que hemos tenido una excelente velada, muy interesante. Quiero agradecer especialmente la participación de Rebeca. Muchas gracias por estar acá. Muchas gracias a todos los participantes. Tendremos una última sesión este año, en diciembre. Leida Fernández va a estar hablándonos sobre historia de la ciencia y historia de la agricultura en América Latina. Ya les enviaré la información con tiempo, pero pues estoy muy contento de haberte tenido acá, Rebeca. Muchísimas gracias, y bueno, espero podernos ver dentro de un mes en la próxima sesión del seminario. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.